everyone, and welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Kelly Olshan. I am a program manager at Queens Council on the Arts. As we kind of get going here, again, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Name, discipline, or organization and social media handle would be great. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that you all can see a PowerPoint that we prepared for this evening. Hope everybody is doing well and appreciate you taking the time to spend your Wednesday evening with us to invest in your artistic practice. As always, we're honored and excited for you to meet the guest speakers that are joining us today. Can someone just give me a verbal affirmation that you can see my screen?
Yes.
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 Perfect. Thanks so much. Okay, so welcome to this professional development event where we're going to dive into what makes a great grant application and take you a little bit behind the scenes as to how these conversations and decisions are made in an arts panel. Wanted to speak a little bit to the vision and purpose behind the workshop and why we're here, quote unquote, and we can pretend that we're all able to convene together at QCA's forthcoming space in Long Island City, pictured here. In essence, tonight we really wanted to create some time and space to give you all a sense, as I mentioned, what happens behind the scenes of an arts panel to further empower you to put together the best application, to understand what makes a strong application and what it's like to be a panelist, what their thought processes are, and sort of democratize what the type of information that artists have access to, and show a little bit of, like, demystify a bit of the behind the scenes as to what an arts panel looks like and how these decisions are made. So tonight we're going to start by just introducing QCA at a glance. If we're not familiar, we'll introduce you to the guest speakers, and then we'll dive into this discussion of the panelists' perspectives, as well as conduct a mock panel for you to see how these types of applications are discussed at QCA and generally speaking in real time. So Queens Council on the Arts, just to give you a quick rundown of who we are and what we're about, we essentially do four key things. Our education portfolio development program called High School to Art School. We offer grants and residencies and portfolio professional development to artists, arts organizations throughout Queens, and creative citizens more generally. We serve the entire borough of Queens. In addition to those sort of three tiers of core programming, often we'll have special projects come up as an opportunity for artists. For instance, right now we have an open call for a public art project in Far Rockaway, so you can check that out online as well. Our High School to Art School program is a free visual arts portfolio development program for teens, where we provide the art skills training and college application assistance, in essence, to help teens get into the art school of their dreams, ideally with a scholarship. So more info at queenscouncilarts.org/H2SA. We're actually currently accepting applications for our spring program that are due February 7th. So if you know any sophomores or juniors that are interested in visual arts, interested in going to art school, would definitely encourage you to send them our way, and they can apply online. Our grants and residency programs include Queens Art Fund and Casa. We'll be giving particular emphasis to the Queens Art Fund tonight, given that the application for the 2021 cycle is coming up on January 24th. This program, as you likely know, offers grants to organizations as well as individual artists. Organizations can receive up to $5K and individual artists up to $3. Though this is a good moment just to flag that while we are going to speak to a Queens Art Fund grant and hopefully provide some information that can assist you in applying to the Queens Art Fund, this isn't a Queens Art Fund dedicated information session. So if you want to really like dive into questions like, am I eligible for Queen's Arts Fund? Should I apply to Arts Access or the Community Arts Grant? That information is really best accessed in a Queen's Art Fund information session, and we'll be publishing that, a recording of that online if you want to watch it or revisit it, even if you already went to a live one. Our Casa program is an artist in residency program that places artists in senior centers across Queens. Our artist commissioning program is a $10,000 opportunity for playwrights, choreographers, and composers. Currently in the process of revamping this program for an open call to be announced in the spring. And another upcoming professional development workshop actually next week on the 19th, where we're gonna dive into what it means to contingency plan for your projects in light of the pandemic, as well as how to think about transitioning work to the digital sphere. So this is also free, would encourage you to check that out. And finally, I wanted to flag that for all of you that are here watching this live, as well as if you attended the first iteration of this workshop, or rather a different iteration of the same workshop, you will receive priority for what we're calling Hit Submit Day Ask an Arts Panelist. And so you'll have essentially first dibs to book a one-on-one session with an arts panelist, including one of the guest speakers we have today. So check your email January 14th, because we're gonna be announcing the arts panelist you can book a one-on-one with, and you'll have a 24-hour window to sign up before anyone else. So be sure to check your email January 14th, more info to come on that. So for tonight, we're really just going to be focusing primarily on these three opportunities. The rationale being that you have some insights. If you're planning to apply to any of these three programs, you have some insights as to what panelists are looking for. And also that information is relevant and can arm you as you're applying for any arts opportunity beyond QCA as well. So with that, I am excited to introduce you to our guest speakers. These three individuals have all served on QCA grants and are leaders in the arts and in Queens, and will be joining us for this entirety of this conversation tonight. And so wanted to introduce them, or rather ask them to introduce themselves, while we sort of give you a refresher visually as to their background. So Jacqui, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hey folks, thanks for being here tonight. My name is Jacqui Dugal. My pronouns are they, them. I'm coming to you from Moonsea Canarsie land, which is AKA Kew Gardens, Queens. I am an artist, I'm a choreographer, I'm also a producer, arts admin. I am approaching this session from the perspective of an artist who has received a QCA grant, from someone who's reviewed on multiple QCA grant panels, including the artist commissioning project as a producer, artist commissioner as well. Yeah, glad to be with you.
Great, thank you so much. Ron?
Hi, everyone. Good to see new and old faces here. I'm Ranya. I'm the executive director of the Louis Latimer House Museum in Flushing, Queens, which is the historic home of Black inventor Louis Latimer, who was also a poet and a painter. And outside of my day job at Latimer House, I also served on a couple of grant panels with Queens Council on the Arts, as well as NYSCA, the New York State Council on the Arts. And we have some opportunities for artists as well at the Latimer House. We love collaborating with local artists, especially artists of color, on projects that are related to the museum's mission. So I will type in our website and email in the chat box if anyone would like to get in touch, and feel free to email us. Thank you.
Thanks, Ron. Yeah, a lot of our Queens Art Fund artists have taken advantage of Lewis Latimer House Museum as a venue, as well as I know you've hosted some public art projects from local artists as well. So great venue and local arts organization, or rather cultural organization to check out. Last but not least, Richard Morales.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Kelly, for inviting me to be a part of this panel discussion. And I look forward to digging a little bit deeper with you all about the process that I've had with Queens Council on the Arts. But just a little bit of background to flesh out what's already on screen. But I currently work at the LGBT Community Center located in the West Village on 13th Street. We're currently closed, but we are offering programming online, such as arts program, youth programming, substance abuse programming, HIV testing. We do have the opportunity where we are able to mail people HIV kits to test themselves at home. So I'm gonna put that info in the chat along with my email if anyone wants to find out a little bit more information. But my role at the center is primarily with our arts and culture programming. So I work with a number of community-based organizations in order to bring arts and culture programming to the center. What does that look like? That's anything ranging from art exhibits, panel discussions, book presentations, film programs, performances, and music, a music series that we work with many artists to put together. So like I said, currently closed, but a lot of those offerings are available online. So I served as the 2019-2020 Artist Commissioner, and I was able to work with a couple of artists based in Masters and Ridgewood for the last year to put together and develop their program. So I'm approaching this program from the standpoint of a commissioner that has worked with artists for about a year long to build up their projects. So thanks again.
Great, thank you so much, Richard. So going back to how we're going to spend the evening together, we're now going to kind of dive into the meat of the workshop, if you will. So we'll spend the next 30 minutes really just a conversation with the three panelists that you just met to dive into their perspective, what evaluating applications looks like for them, and sort of a discussion of best and worst practices, if you will. So you have a sense of what the people who are making the funding decisions perspective looks like. After that, we're going to dive into a mock panel discussion of real and fictionalized applications from the Queens Art Fund and ACP. And then we'll have time at the end to do questions and next steps. In addition to, at the very end for questions, we'll have a moment after the panel's perspective to address any specific questions. So but just ask you to please hold your questions to those discrete moments, because we don't have the ability to respond to them in the chat in real time. So that'll help us make sure that we're best able to address any questions that you may have. Great. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the screen share as we transition to a discussion with our three panelists. So as Ron, Richard, and Jacqui alluded to, all three of these panelists have served either in the Queens Art Fund or the Artist Commissioning Program, evaluating Queens Council on the Arts applications and ultimately making funding decisions. But for those who might not be familiar with what a panelist perspective, what that looks like, I would love for you all to just kind of walk us through the process. So if you are serving as a QCA panel, what happens after an artist submits their application? Can you walk us through the process from the moment they hit submit to the moment the funding decision is made? Jacqui, I'd love to start with you, because maybe you could speak to Queens Art Fund specifically as someone who has applied and received funding as a Queens Art Fund artist, as well as served as a panelist for that program.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, coming from both those perspectives, once you hit submit, I know what that feeling is like, and it's a relief off your shoulders, but also this like tension of, and now I wait. But yeah, once that happens, as a panelist, usually I would have gotten emails from Kelly or Jenna at QCA saying like, hey, make sure you set some time aside. You'll probably be reviewing 40-ish number of applications, and then get ready for a meeting together. So usually it looks like receiving links and documents of applications, scheduling my personal time to make sure I read every single one, take notes on them, have the kind of selection and review criteria from QCA to make my notes and to give a score usually to each section of an application based on the criteria. And then with all of my personal notes, then coming together with all the panelists that have reviewed, usually in a long day of like 9 a.m. to 5 or 6, we're all there together at a table, going through, taking note of the scores and discussing mostly which scores are in the middle. So usually the applications that really stand out and that are really great, most of the time, most panelists are like, yeah, that sounds good. Most of the applications that have not fulfilled all requirements or were completed or aren't fit for the time, usually is like, okay, we mostly agree. And then it's the ones that are kind of in the middle that we all want to discuss and hear each other out on why we think they should or shouldn't receive a grant at that time.
Great. Thanks, Jacqui. That's a helpful start to finish overview. Ron, maybe you could pick up where Jacqui left off and explain to folks why is it so important with the Queen's Art Fund? Why does so much of the conversation hinge upon the middle of the road applicants, so to speak?
Yeah, sure. So just like Jacqui said, so each panelist reviews all the grants, and then we we meet in person to further discuss. So because the fund has a limited amount of grants that they can give out, and so the top scored applications are not controversial, and we want to make sure that the applications in the middle range, that we give them thorough considerations and discussions to make sure that the ones that we think really deserve funding gets past that threshold to be funded. And then yeah, because those are the ones that are kind of close in scores, and we want to make sure that we get it right.
Yeah, absolutely. So in other words, just to really hit this point home for everyone, the way that the Queen's Art Fund program works is that collectively the panelists will establish sort of a cutoff score, and everything above that score is funded and everything below that score is not. And so the difference between sort of a middle of the road application and an above average application is the difference between receiving funding or not. And that's something that is roughly unique to Queen's Art Fund because we are able to fund more artists and organizations, which is unlike the artist commissioning program, which I want to sort of transition to now, which in the past at least has selected 4 artists to receive a $10,000 commission. So Richard, as a commissioner from last year that was on the panel that decided who received $10,000 commissions, in what ways was the artist commissioning program application different, and how could you sort of describe that process to prospective applicants?
Sure, and thanks again. The process, I think, is a little different than QAF, where there's really no not that much discussion of middle of the road applicants. I know when we received the submissions, it was also related to the neighborhoods that we're talking about. In this case, it was Ridgewood and Maspeth along with Flushing. And in other years, it's been Jamaica. In other years, it's been another location in Queens. So I think one of the main things was that was really important was its relevance to the neighborhood, was the starting point. And we basically were about 7 different commissioners from the same area that were looking at these proposals. So artists submitted their projects or their proposals, and then as a group, we kind of like whittled it down to the ones that we were going to really focus on. So the initial applicants that we looked at, you know, the ones that didn't really fit the neighborhood, that didn't really fit the project description in terms of talking about what an untold story was, you know, those were immediately removed from that round. And then we really focused on the ones that were going to be, that we were going to be looking at extensively. And then through the online portal that QCA provided, we were able to look at least whittle down like 80 applicants down to 19, 20, maybe a little bit more depending on who or where you were. I know Flushing received a lot more than Maspeth did. And so based on that, we would then look through each of the submissions that the artist submitted and look at their work samples, look at their project description, and then really amongst all of us within the group, have that conversation about why this project is, what untold story is being told through their project, why it was important for the neighborhoods that we were talking about to have that involved, and you know why we felt that they needed to be supported through the funds that were provided. So you know, this wasn't just a like Richard decide that and that's it. This is really like a conversation amongst members of the community that were involved in the process. And so I think it's pretty much the same way with QAF where you talk about this, but we definitely like kind of whittled it down between like the ones that obviously didn't work and then the ones that were really clear and concise and that fit the description and the project.
Yeah, I'm glad you made that point that it's not just Richard deciding, because I think there's a couple common myths when it comes to grant applications. Myth number one being that QCA staff sit on their high horses and make the funding decisions in a vacuum, which is not the case. QCA staff actually play no role in determining who receives money other than simply just playing facilitator and marketing the opportunity and so on. So that's number one. And then two, every grant panel that looks at artist applications, we have at least 5, usually 5 to 7 panelists that are representative of the Queens community and the cultural community. So we have a variety of different perspectives that are weighing in and collectively making these decisions. So going back to the moment in which you all are evaluating these individual artists or organizational applications, what are some of the things that make an application stand out to you in a positive way? Ron, let's start with you.
Great. I think the top criteria is clarity, because I think application really demonstrates whether the project is thought through, whether the applicant knows what they plan to do, what their goals are, and how to achieve their goals. So clarity is definitely the most important thing. So that includes whether the application answers all the questions clearly, and whether there are the when, who, how, and why. And the why includes the artistic intention or the goal of the project that oftentimes makes an application stands out. Another thing is whether the project fits the specific goals of this particular grant, because each grant program has a different mission or goal in itself. Some projects are amazing, but they just don't fit this particular grant's goal. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Comparing your project proposal to the named goals and criteria of the grant is always the best practice. So for QAF applicants, for example, I would encourage you to, there's these 4 or 5 evaluation criteria listed on our website. Keep those front and center, because in the room, the panelists, back when we met in person, QCA staff literally post those on the wall in giant font. Everything that you are when they're scoring your application in the back end, it's against those evaluation criteria. So when we or another arts organization give you the rubric to the thing, take us seriously and use it to put together a better application, your best application. Yeah, Jacqui, you're nodding. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I agree. I agree with everything you just said, and also Ron. And I think something else that really makes a great application is a very clear budget that also tells the story. So not only that your written portions tell the story of what you're doing and why and how and all of those things, but also a budget can tell a story as well. So being really clear about that, having accurate estimates and numbers for all of those budget line items. Also that you're paying people is really important too, that you're paying yourself, and that everything adds up. I always suggest do the math like 3 or 4 times, always double check, because it's a very simple thing, but it makes a really big difference.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to come back to budget later and give you all some examples of what Jacqui just said, for sure. Richard, what about you? What makes an application stand out?
I think pretty much what most people have already mentioned. I think in terms of the budget, one thing that definitely stood out when I was looking at some of the proposals was just the blatant statement of like using the budget for something else that was not related to the project at all. There was definitely a project description where they were applying for this like more performance-based project, but then they said whatever's left over, they were going to use to print a magazine that had nothing to do with the initial project that they were applying for. And that definitely stood out as a red flag for me in terms of like just the use of funds that we were providing. So definitely, you know, if you're going to be putting items in your budget, make sure that it's something that's included in the actual project that you're applying for. I think one thing for me that's super important, and I know this is an issue of access also and accessibility to documentation materials, but work samples are definitely something that are really important for me when I'm looking at applications. Also understanding that not everybody has access to the best recording equipment, or that not everyone has the best access for editing or lighting or any of that. So, you know, that shouldn't be a deterrent for anyone to apply for any programs that they think like, well, you know, it's not the best documented. But those things I think are things that we as panelists also take into account and look at and also understand, you know. But you know, I do look at work samples, and I do look at clarity of vision. I think for the Queen's Artist Commissioning project, it was a little bit different because we did look for things that were able to be reproduced in other areas. That was one of the kind of like rubrics of the program itself, you know. So reproducibility, you know, really understanding like the description and the criteria of the program that you're applying for, and understanding that is definitely something that is that I look at when looking at the project description and how the project is going to be executed. So clarity, budget, work sample.
Excellent. Yeah, I was about to summarize the three things, but I think that was it. Clarity in the narrative, clarity in the budget, and work samples. There's a couple questions coming into the chat about budget specifics. We're actually going to get to that in the next section. But let's transition to common mistakes and pitfalls. We kind of touched on this when Jacqui, you were talking about budget line items not adding up. What else comes to mind when you think about some sort of common mistakes or errors that you would warn artists or applicants against?
Yeah, I think to reiterate, definitely budget not adding up is a big one. Noticing that items aren't listed in the budget that they've clearly mentioned in other areas of the application. Also, I feel like we've probably said and heard this a million times, but just not following the directions is always a big one. It's usually the first thing in the review room that we have to say, well, this person didn't include this part, or this went against the rules. So do we all agree that they're automatically disqualified? And then, you know, we take a vote and go from there. So really, I always urge, read all the materials that you have for whatever the application is multiple times. Like Kelly and everyone has said, like double check the mission of it, the selection criteria. Yeah, don't let like a small mistake count you out right from the beginning.
Good advice. Rod, anything to add?
Yeah, in addition to the budget lines adding up that Jacqui mentioned, I would also suggest always including budget notes, because sometimes applicants fill in the numbers, but the notes are not required. Sometimes they're left in blank, but I would always fill them in with a brief explanation of the numbers, whether it's, say, X number of hours and Y dollars per hour, and then the total, or something like printing for marketing or website design for this. So just a brief budget note always helps. Another thing is oftentimes when the application is kind of long and people work through them from top to bottom. And sometimes as they work through them, there can be some inconsistencies between different sections. And that's natural, because I write a lot of grant applications for the museum too. And I always have to reread them, double check to make sure all the numbers and all the project descriptions are consistent. Because while I fill in the form, sometimes ideas develop or details change. So that's another thing. You know, speaking of work samples, sometimes work samples are missing, or the links don't work, or the resolutions are too low. Those are a common, I would say, shortfall. And another thing, sometimes the artists are proposing, say, to do a video about like a natural nature video. That's just a random example that came to my mind. But the work samples are like completely a different style or different genre. So definitely make sure the work samples represent the type of work you are proposing to do.
I would say that in terms of, I mentioned one of the mistakes that I saw in how someone broke down their budget and it not matching or being related to the project. But one of the things also that I see, not just with QCA, but just in other projects and that I'm working on commissioning for my work at the center, is that oftentimes artists are using the same application for multiple organizations, and the language doesn't really match up. So I think I would also recommend like really spending time and getting to know the organization that you're applying to for funding, because their mission might not align with the project, right? Oftentimes the language doesn't really match up either. So I do recommend like really getting to know the organization that you're asking funds from, and doing like a deep dive into their website and to their blogs, their social media, or any other outlet that you can, just to get a grasp of like what the kind of like mission and vision of the organization itself is, because sometimes it can be used in terms of language for the application, as opposed to just like copy and pasting the same application multiple times for multiple organizations or multiple sources of funding. So I would recommend doing the deep dive and learning about the org before you apply for it.
Yeah, that's definitely good advice. And I think the applicants will get more mileage out of their work that way, that it's sort of a quality rather than quantity approach. Of course, as someone who applies for grants as an artist and through QCA, we all have boilerplate information that's great to have on file, a sort of artist statement, for example, a biography, a core description of a program. That's great to repurpose. But I agree with Richard that you'll get more mileage out of it if it's really tailored to the unique opportunity. One thing that I tend to do that I actually, as a tip I got in grad school from someone who is a development expert, it's so simple, but we'll literally just, when reading the grant descriptions, we'll pull out keywords and highlight them and sort of use it as like a word bank or a keywords bank, and work that language back into the narrative of the proposal. So you're sort of speaking the language of the priorities of which the organization already outlined to you. Anyway, I want to get to questions. I think we have time for 2 for this section. Want to explain to people, though, that we're going to do a deeper dive in just a minute and get a little bit more specific. So if you have any questions about what the panelists just shared, this would be a great moment to do so. Feel free to put it in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and simply just ask verbally.
There's one question that was in there that I kind of responded to about like, how about work samples from good, sorry if I'm not pronouncing this, but Gartier Lee. How about work samples? Does work sample and promotional materials play a role? If so, how much? I mean, I'd say like there's a difference between promo materials and work samples. I think I mentioned that also. You know, I think promo materials might be good to prove that an event happened, say like a flyer or something like that. It does prove that the event took place. I mean, but it doesn't really say anything about the work. So I would make the distinction between like including flyers and promo materials as something completely separate from actual work samples. A work sample would be a video or a snippet of that performance. A work sample would be a script of that performance. Let's say I'm using performance as an example, but you know, or a detail of a painting or something. Those would function for me more as work samples rather than like a flyer, you know, or promo materials.
Great. One more question from Tashrika Sharma, and forgive me if I got your name wrong, but they ask, for video art with a narrative, the details on production can really add up. What type of information is usually enough to give you a feeling for a realistic timeline for producing video? So I think this question could be generalized as well to when you're writing a project narrative, how much detail is too much and how much is needed?
Yeah, I can jump in a little. I think what details will help show a panelist that you know what needs to go into a project to get it done. Because usually that's something we're also thinking about in the room is, can this specific artist do this specific project? Is there proof in this application or in previous work that it's feasible? Feasibility is something that we definitely consider. So I think we don't need to know every detail that you'll upload documents on this day. but we do want to know that you know it needs to be done for the type of work that you're doing, and you can communicate that to us.
Yeah, I just enough details for people, for readers to understand the what, when, who, how, and why. And just to briefly go back to the previous question, so I think work samples are definitely very important, because that's the most the one thing that we go to evaluate the artistic quality of the proposals.
I'd say for video art, you know, I have sat on film festival screening committees, and I've come across submissions that weren't the final product, but it was stated in the description or as kind of like a watermark within the film submission itself that there needed to be color correction added, or that there were certain parts of the film submission that needed some tweaking with the audio. So that's not an end all for people on the other side to say yes or no to that. I just think that if those are the things that are needed, you know, that be stated in the description when you're submitting, like, hey, I'm submitting this video art. It's not completed, but hopefully with this funding, you know, would love to complete this project. That depends also on the criteria of the project that you're, or the funding that you're looking for. If you're applying for something that is looking for new work, then you probably don't want to have a work in progress submitted. So that's where you really need to understand what you're applying for and what you're submitting to do that. But if it is something that's like asking about works in progress, then it's just a matter of being clear about that. You know, I'm not saying state everything that needs to be done, but it is helpful to know.
Great, thank you. It's good advice. I want to transition to the next section of the evening, the mock panel. I see that there's more questions in the chat, but I think that they'll actually be addressed in the next section. And if they're not, we'll be taking more questions at the end. So I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. Let's see here. Okay, so we're calling this next section the good, the bad, and the funded, which is my tongue-in-cheek way of trying to walk you all through some real and fictionalized examples of mostly QA applications. So together, we're going to look at 3 mock proposals. The first one is really ineffectual. It's fictionalized, but it's based off of hundreds of real Queen's Art Fund applications that the Queen's Art Fund manager and I put together. The second one is a on-the-cusp proposal, so fictionalized again, but based on real Queen's Art Fund applications that were really kind of on the cusp to potentially receive funding and potentially not receive funding. And then finally, we'll look at a real project description of an ACP, Artist Commissioning Program awardee, and we're going to address budget in here as well for those of you applying to QAF. So going to go ahead and dive in. The way this is going to work is we're going to do kind of an abbreviated version of a mock panel. So in all of our panels, we assign a lead reader, which is kind of the person that guides us through and is the expert on that respective proposal. So with the help of the 3 guest speakers, we're just going to talk about these mock applications the way we would in an actual grant panel. So diving right in, looking at this next one for the Queen's Art Fund new work application. So this is for the new work grant. Have copied the Queen's Art Fund grant description here. So of course, the first thing you would do is to read, if you're applying for the new work grant, is to read what this project funds. So in this case, it's Queen's Case individual artists for the creation of new work and so on. So here is a sample project narrative, and Ron, I'm going to just ask you to read the highlighted section.
Sure. I plan a staged reading of my play in Queen's Theaters, which I've been writing and researching for years. The project brings to life over 10 characters, all based on real people, mostly from Queens. The show utilizes puppets and actors to portray the storyline. The full production will involve the construction of a portable puppet theater. The staged reading is a step towards a full production. I'm hoping that by having the reading in a good venue to get more people in Queens interested, and thus help me work towards this goal.
Great, thanks, Ron. All right, panelists, after reading this project description, do you have a clear sense of what this new work will be?
I don't at all. I just know that it's going to incorporate puppets and actors, and that's it. I don't even know what the play would be about.
Okay. Jacqui, Ron, do you have a vision of your head of what this will look like, sound like, be like?
Same. In short answer, no. I know what some logistical elements might be, but the core of the work has not yet been explained.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think I have so many questions after reading this paragraph. I guess the biggest question is, what is the play, or I mean, what is it actually about? What is the storyline? I have no clue. So it's very murky.
Mm-hmm.
I also think, like, you know, there could be some clarity in terms of like locations. I know they mentioned Queen's Theaters, but it would be helpful to at least like have some examples of theaters that the person is interested in, because then that can kind of like give us a sense of what the audience would be like. Like, for example, if they're going to do it in Thalia Theater in Queens, that skews more like Latinx oriented, right? So it does give a little bit more info. Yeah, I mean, that would be helpful to know. Queens has so many theaters and production spaces, so I don't know why they didn't list any of them.
Yeah, for Queen's Art Fund applicants, though, there is a separate section to really dive into the prospective venue. So that's a place you could answer that question more in depth. But our Queen's Arts Fund manager does recommend sort of using the core project description as almost like a synopsis, and that all of the top level, most important information can be found there. So to extend Richard's example, perhaps you mention a prospective venue here, and then you can use the other section in the narrative to the application to give a little bit more explanation as to why you chose that venue and why you're hoping to work with that partner. Great. Do you all have a sense, is it clear to you that this is proposing new work?
No, because they say that they've been writing and researching for years. And it seems like they already have the project. Like, yeah, it doesn't seem like a new project.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's unclear if this is meant to be the final, like a culminating production, or a work in progress. As they say, like the staged reading is a step towards a full production. So yeah, exactly what they're planning for this project specifically is still unclear.
Right. It's a little confusing whether this is for the reading or for the production, because it sounds like this is for the reading, but it also mentions that this is part of the full or a step towards the production, and that creates potential confusions. If it's just to support the reading, maybe just focus on what the reading is about instead of including the full production.
Yeah. What are we funding? What does the final iteration of this project look like? Great. I want to just kind of move on to, so our staff put together kind of list of trends among some less effective project narratives, predominantly focused on QAF. So I'll read these, and then panelists, feel free to chime in if there's anything that you feel like we missed or that you would add to this list. So we talked a lot about lack of clarity around whether the applicant is proposing new work, which is what the Queen's Art Fund New Work Grant is looking for. It's in the name. Incomplete materials, needs proofreading, budgets that don't add up or aren't realistic. We haven't spoken to this as much, but work samples that might be difficult to see or hear, poorly photographed or uncropped images. Does that feel right to you all? Do you have anything to add here?
That seems right.
Yeah, yeah, I agree.
Great. Well, let's move on to the on-the-cusp application, because as we've talked about, these are often the most consequential applications among a QAF panel. So someone in the chat asked about the Queen's Arts Fund eligibility criteria, what they are and why they're so important. So this is for you. Here are the 4 QAF evaluation criteria. I won't read them here, but these are really important because, as we mentioned before, these are the criteria in which your application is judged. So artistic merit, clarity, community benefit, and feasibility, essentially. And so we're gonna, I think another question in the chat was, we're talking a lot about clarity. I think that's come up because it's something that's a common mistake. But I think it's also particularly relevant for this conversation about project narratives and about budgets, because that's the most common mistake among those. Whereas with work samples, that's more about the best way to accurately and in a compelling fashion present your own work, which is more of a creative process that hinges less upon clarity in the traditional sense. So moving right along, again, this is a fictionalized project narrative based on a lot of applications that were on the cusp of receiving a new work grant. So an application that could almost receive funding or might not receive funding. It's really just kind of a middle of the road. So Jacqui, do you mind reading the highlighted project narrative?
Sure. The project will consist of 10 photographic assemblage pieces for exhibition. Each image will focus on one ethical or moral issue, using models to represent human interactions with the world through an artistic lens. I will start photographing Queen's subjects for this project by winter 2021. Around this time, I will also begin connecting with people around different Queens neighborhoods to build community interest. These conversations will strengthen the neighborhood support as well as inform the artistic imagery. Around June, I will start assembling and collaging the photographed images in earnest. From about June to September, I will be working on the layout and potentially gathering more photography. By late September, I will have the final prints made. In October, the photographs will be collected and ready to show at the Plaxville Gallery in Long Island City for a 3-week exhibition.
Thanks, Jacqui. Okay, thoughts on the narrative. After reading this, do you all have a clear sense of what the new work will be?
I wouldn't say that it would be 100% clear, but it's pretty close to it. I think the kind of vague part is like the what the ethical and moral issues are that I would question, because I would want to know what those are. But I think it was pretty clear in terms of a breakdown of their timeline that they provided, and that for me would pique my interest, at least, because at least we have an idea of like when they plan on doing things and what that would look like.
Mm-hmm. Jacqui, Ron?
Yeah, I think I'm interested just to get more meat in there, more details specifically about, what are these issues? Are there like stylistic choices to discuss? maybe what this completed exhibition will look like and feel like, and also how. A little bit about like this connection with neighborhood is interesting to me, but I'm wondering, how will this person be connecting with people around the neighborhood? How do they, plan to build community interest and strengthen neighborhood support? What does that mean to them? Yeah, I'm curious for details around the rhetoric.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. It says each image will focus on one ethical or moral issue. That seems too broad, and for us to understand what the image is gonna look like, or where the artistic direction is going.
Right. Yeah, for me, I walk away from this project narrative without a clear picture in my head of what these 10 photographic assemblage pieces look like, or even what they're about beyond the one ethical or moral issue. So I agree, we're raising some questions here around the content of the work, the rationale behind connecting with communities, or who they're choosing to connect with and why and how. Another thing here is that we spend a lot of time on the timeline. Again, in the Queen's Art Fund application, there's a separate section dedicated to the timeline. So the project narrative should be more about the meat of your actual art. And here, if you break this down visually, we have about 2/3 of it dedicated to logistics and timeline. I think that real estate could be better spent diving into the what and why of the artistic product. So panelists, is there anything else that if you were sitting down with this artist, what suggestions might you make for improvement?
I think artists tend to be very conceptual. And it's a matter of translating what's inside their brain to page, which sometimes works but sometimes doesn't work. Like using models to represent humans' interactions with the world through an artistic lens just seems so wordy and conceptual to me that I'm just like, I don't know what that means. What artistic lens? So I would advise them to again, going back to what we were saying or what we're repeating, is just to really just approach it from the standpoint of like, you're speaking to someone that doesn't know you, and that not to dumb it down. I wouldn't say that, but to really make sure that it's translatable to someone that doesn't know the work and is just meeting you through your work for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I would add also, kind of as a way to answer this question in the chat about should you give more clarity on timing of the exhibition, I would say look at all the elements of the grant application to see, there is time for specific timeline notes later on. Like Kelly said, use that real estate wisely. So I would not add more details on the date of the exhibition here. I would really focus on the core of the work and finding the clear, efficient ways to share that with someone that's a complete stranger.
I'd agree. Whether the exhibition is on July 23rd or July 30th, it's not going to make a difference in terms of whether or not you get a grant, especially with COVID and all these contingency plans happening. We care more about what you're doing and why it's important.
Yeah, and sometimes if it's if you feel like just by writing doesn't fully convey your ideas, maybe you can refer to the work samples in the narrative or in other answers. You could say see work sample for an example of blah blah blah. Yeah, that might help.
Mm-hmm. I think it's also worth reminding that I think the way that I review grant session or applications, at least, you're not looking at the images or content simultaneously. So it's helpful to have a sense of what the work is just from reading the narrative, and then enable the work samples can support that vision. Okay, let's move on to the budget. We put together a sample budget that makes some of the, to highlight some of like the common mistakes and errors that Jacqui and Ron were pointing out earlier. So here is an example budget, and like Ron mentioned, there's a place to put an amount and there's a place to put a description. So Ron, can you remind people what you were saying about the importance of this itemized description explanation?
Yeah, so my is it not required by QAF to fill in the notes? Because I think with other general grants, it's usually not required. But as you can see here, it really helps to give you a better understanding of how the funding in each category is being used. So it's very helpful to have those details.
Yeah, I think it's especially helpful when you're talking about paying individuals, which of course you should absolutely do, but just to understand how you got to 1,200, for example. Without this explanation, artistic personnel 1,200, we don't really know what that means. But if you explain, oh, I'm going to be in the studio for 120 hours at $10 an hour, that starts to make a ton of sense. Another thing that came up in the chat was asking about, so here's the expenses budget, right? So all of the money out that you're spending on your project, which is totaled here. And then another question that came up in the chat is how to handle what we call in-kind income. So for example, if anyone is got a donated materials, or a friend is helping you install the exhibition, that's what we would call in-kind support. And so you can certainly list that here, and it's not something that necessarily has a dollar amount, but you can estimate it. So their value of their services is worth $500, and so you can say, call it in-kind support and list it under project income. So going back to some common mistakes, Jacqui, I believe, mentioned just things not adding up. Another really common mistake we see in these QAF budgets is simply the numbers not adding up. So the way that this should work is your total expenses at the end of table 1, so right here, should be carried down here. Total income tallied, added up, carried down here. And so you have expenses minus income equals total grant request. I repeat, expenses minus income equals total grant request. So what you're not doing if you're requesting $3,000 from an individual artist, as an individual artist from QCA, that's not part of your income. That doesn't go here. The income for the project in QAF sense is anything else that outside of QAF funding. And so the way it should work is when you subtract income from expenses, you're getting exactly the amount that you're requesting as an individual artist, which we recommend you go ahead and request that full $3,000 amount. Yeah. So other common mistakes that Jacqui mentioned that you need to pay yourself, that you put amounts in the right column. This is silly, but we'll see people put a number over here under itemized, and then, that messes the formula up and the numbers don't add up. So just make sure you put the numbers under the amount column. Anything else? Anything that I missed, especially Jacqui and Ron, who have sat on QAF panels? Any other common budget-related mistakes that make you cringe?
Well, I think something that comes to mind that's also coming up as questions in the chat is income required? Mostly yes, and I think also like double check the specific grant requirements. For some, they require that 25% funding come from some other place besides that grant. And I think what Kelly was saying about it, like in-kind donations or donated space or donated labor, your friend or your partner coming to do things with you, that can count as income to help you reach those numbers and those percentages. So really don't underestimate things that are already at your disposal that you might be taking for granted, and just not think about that as, that could be an estimated number on this income line, and help you reach, the number and the math that you need for the specific proposal.
Yeah, I can speak to that question. In the past, we did require a 25% match, meaning that 25% of your project income should be coming from someone or something other than QCA. That's actually not the case anymore, which we're super excited about. To be transparent, QCA staff were never really a big fan of that. It was just something that we inherited from the city and the state. So this year, because of COVID, we're not requiring a 25% match. So you don't need to have income other than QCA, but I still really think everything that Jacqui said stands. I think, in this game of fundraising and grant writing, no funder wants to be the only one funding a project. It's kind of how this game works. So I think the more that you can show here, the better. And like Jacqui said, it doesn't have to be another fancy grant. It can be in-kind support of your partner helping you install something and you're ascribing a monetary value to that. Also keep in mind, these don't have to be finalized. So for example, if you're a visual artist, maybe you're hopeful that you'll sell $1,000 worth of paintings, put that down and call it a pending income. So I would just really encourage you to, even though we're not requiring it, I wouldn't leave this blank. I would encourage you to be creative. And I think that most artists are receiving some sort of support or help to make something happen. And I think it's just a matter of documenting and communicating that here. Okay, I want to move on to the final real funded application. So this is a real project description pulled from our artist commissioning program. Just copy pasted here the core funding priorities and criteria from ACP. I won't read this, but essentially all you need to know is that this program is looking for a project that tells an untold story of underrepresented persons, highlighting the stories of individual protagonists. So people see a vision of themselves as leading characters. And I'm going to ask Richard to read this description because he was actually on the panel that gave this artist, Michelle Palmieri, a $10,000 commission. So Richard, take it away.
Sure. So this is from Michelle Palmieri, and her project is, I want to tell the stories of Latin, female, and LGBTQ characters who have an essential role in our society but are currently underrepresented in the mainstream Latin music scene. The story of Abuela Consuelo, for instance, cooking every day for a family of 10 and passing on her cultural traditions through food. The story of Marta, who had to fight against cultural prejudice to be in a homosexual relationship. I want to tell my story, an immigrant white Latina with an identity crisis fed by the fact that her skin tone and body features don't match the stereotypical image of the Latina woman portrayed in mass culture. As a consequence of these characters' underrepresentation and misrepresentation, children born from Latin immigrants growing up in the United States have a lack of role models who can echo their cultural traditions and at the same time inform them of the new canons of a constantly changing society. To give Latin youth role models to identify with and to aspire to, I will write, record, and premiere Canciones for a New World, a bilingual Spanish-English song cycle for children.
Great, thank you. There is more text here that you all can reference on your own time, but that's essentially the bulk of it. So thank you, Richard. So turning to discussion, what do you all think is working well in this proposal? Clearly she did something right if she got a $10,000 grant.
I I mean, I'm biased because I sat in on this panel, but I think it definitely fit with the description of the project itself in terms of telling an untold story. As someone that identifies as a Puerto Rican queer cis male, I understand where she's coming from in the sense of like the topics that sometimes can be taboo in specific cultural or ethnic groups. And so, you know, I think for me, it was very clear what she wanted to do and where this was coming from on a personal level for her. And obviously there's, from what I've read, there's a bit more in the description, but I think she also had a clear breakdown of where she wanted this stuff to be, or this project to be premiered, and what the demographic of the group was that she wanted to work with.
Yeah, she goes on to talk about why her untold story is relevant to this particular neighborhood and has some data to sort of support why her story might be relevant to this community. Ron, Jacqui, what else is working well here?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a narrative that I can almost feel as I read it. I feel like I know a little bit about this person, which I didn't get from the previous narratives. I have these like rich bits of story already in here. You know, I'm getting examples already of why this is particularly and exceptionally important, you know, for this person, for their community, you know, specifically children from Latin immigrant homes. I'm getting lots of richness in one single bite, and that's really exciting and satisfying. So like one makes me want to read more about this, and I'm already getting an experience in a sense, which lets me know that, you know, some of these boxes are checked off, and that's great.
Yeah, I totally agree with Richard and Jacqui that this proposal, first of all, stands out because it fits the purpose of the grant really well, and also it demonstrates a strong and clear artistic intention and how the artist plans to reach the goal and address the issue through their works.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if anyone is listening to this and wondering, you know, how their work might, how they can write a compelling narrative in a similar way, even though their work is really different and maybe less, I don't know, we've gotten a lot of questions about, okay, what if I don't really politicize my work in that way, or make what I consider social justice work. I still think that we still absolutely accept all types of work for the Queen's Art Fund. And I think the piece that I would advise you to take away here is more that, as Jacqui said, she's telling she, meaning Michelle, is telling a really rich story about the work that gives you a concrete sense of what it looks like, what it feels like, and why you should care about it. So I think regardless of the type of work that you make, you can extrapolate those two core things, that it's about telling the story of your work and painting a picture, or you know, whatever medium you use, in a compelling way, and then convincing the panelists that it's important and it's exciting and it deserves to be made. Okay, so for reference, you all, in this worksheet that I shared and will share again after the workshop, there is a simple budget associated with Michelle's project, but not going to read it now, actually going to in there in the hopes of transitioning to questions. We can go until 7:30, and I can maybe stick around for a few more minutes to answer any specific questions that people might have that are really specific to their particular application. But want to open the floor now to anyone who might have questions for the panelists on any points that they brought up, or questions for me as well.
Hi, how are you? I do have a question. So I noticed that this project narrative and budget workshop paperwork is available in the link that we received for the meeting tonight. But I'm a little confused though about a couple of the panelists were talking about, particularly Ron was talking about putting in the budget, the notes. So the one previous to that was on the cusp, and yet the budget itself looks so much more detailed and comprehensive. But the one that was funded didn't give any explanation for the expenses. There were no notes or anything. So I was just wondering, because I would have thought the one that was the cusp, except that I agree that the one that was funded had a much better project narrative. But the budget, it was like, well, that would have been great if the budget one for the third one was for the last one. So maybe Jacqui or Ron or Richard or yourself might comment on that.
Yeah, Noreen, that's a really great question. I can speak to that as the person that made this worksheet. Actually, the second sample budget was not an on-the-cusp budget. That's something that I made as an example. So you're right, and that's a stronger budget example.
Oh, okay. So,
I can totally understand why that's confusing, so I apologize for that, and we'll make a note to iterate that worksheet moving forward. But the reason we wanted to share a more shining example of the budget is didn't want to confuse you with a negative example. I know for me, like once I see it, a number's done the wrong way, it's kind of hard to unsee it. So yes, your takeaway can be that the second one is an example of a strong budget. And the last one is more simple purely because of the artist commissioning program asking for a much more simple budget. So
thank you very much. I'm glad to hear that, because I was thinking that was it actually looked like it was a great sample.
Yes, you all can definitely use the second one as an example. Any other questions from the panelists?
There are also different mediums too. Like one's photography and has a little bit more like hanging fees involved and all this other stuff that the performance doesn't really need when you're recording an album.
Yeah, and the artist commissioning program is unique in the sense that it's to commission a new work and to pair the selected artists with art commissioners or art producers to together figure out the details and produce the work. So it's different in the sense that it places more focus on the artistic quality and the fitness to the social justice narrative around untold stories instead of all the details of the project.
Great, that's a good point too.
I have
a couple more questions from the chat that I'm going to read for the panelists. So from Scoop Sloan, who asks, for the subject the moderator brought up about work that doesn't necessarily focus on political and social justice narratives and content, how do you personally see alternate project themes having relevancy and a voice not only in QCA's mission as with the greater or other emerging artist transdisciplinary platforms? So my understanding, and Scoop, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question verbally if you want to clarify a little bit.
Hi everyone. I feel like it's explanatory what I'm asking. I wouldn't have asked it had you not included in your moderation that you don't only consider projects of those particular focuses. But essentially that's the question. I feel like even being a queer artist in avant-garde settings, that if I don't present myself, I would rather be something than have to put myself something on paper so that the work actually speaks for itself without myself having to state I am a queer artist in order to get, oh, okay, they're queer, then we can consider their application. Do you know what I'm saying? I feel like there's a bias towards I don't want to say fitting into an agenda, but I would rather my work speak for itself versus having my personal narrative, even though my work is based upon personal narrative. I don't want it to be consequenced as saying it's queer art, so it's relevant, right? So even though my subject matters aren't always related to queer art, in my last piece, when I was interviewed, even though the work was actually in a queer Buto festival, the question by the interviewer was, after having had an interview for probably an hour over the phone with her, and then her editor coming back and saying, we need more clarification. Why is your movement specifically queer? What about your movement is queer? Like having to quantify, you know, when my particular internal narrative is my narrative and how it translates to the viewer is supposed to be filtered through their worldview and their experience, not what I'm telling them to experience, right? So that I hope that's coming across in that way. And so I guess it's more of like a broad question, I think, in terms of grants in general, but knowing that people are writing for this organization as well. So maybe that clarifies, I guess.
Yeah, I think I can speak on this a little bit, and I'm sure others too. I also agree. I think there's kind of a difference between what is the theme of the work and the work itself, and then like who is the person, who are the creators and makers of this work that it's filtering through their worldview. I don't think that queer art needs to be, you know, the work itself doesn't always need to be queer, but that it's coming through that lens of a queer person, which I also am, is enough. I think looking back to like what is the ask in the specific application you're looking in is important. Just considering again like what they're looking for. But I do hear you and I agree. Yeah.
From a reviewing panelist standpoint, I don't ever put myself in a position to question anybody's identity as an applicant, you know, and I kind of approach it from a blank state or zero state, and I do agree that, you know, it really shouldn't be a part of the conversation unless it's necessary in the work that's being submitted or reviewed. But I've definitely worked with artists that are abstract painters and they're like, well, my work isn't typically like queer because it's not a particular style or image, but you know, in terms of the political aspect, you know, and you know, that I don't think that, again, it all boils down to just the description of the grant that you're applying for and how best it fits that. Now, if there's anything that has to do with identity that is involved in that project, then I would be, you know, I would be very clear with that if it's necessary, but it's not a make or break situation from, you know.
Right, I agree. So under our context with the two grants that are mentioned in the examples, like I said, the artist commissioning grant has a particular purpose. It was set up to tell untold stories. So the panelists will be looking for that when evaluating the applications. Whereas for QAF, I think it was set up just to nurture the overall health of the entire artist community in Queens. So we don't talk about identities as a criteria when we review grant applications, unless it is, unless there are some works that we have questions about whether this is exploitative or cultural appropriations, that might come into the discussion, but we don't use identity as a criteria to say whether this work is good or bad.
Okay, thank you. I want to get to a couple more questions. We have a couple more that are related to defining and understanding your audience. So first one was from Renee, who asked, with the demographics of Queens being so varied, is it detrimental to have a broader appeal? it seems that a quote target audience implies you want the application to get specific.
I mean, I think we're in a time where I've definitely seen this in applications where we want to be all inclusive, and that's great if it speaks to the project itself, but I think it's also really helpful and can be powerful to be intentional and say, this is going to speak to, you know, Black immigrant experience or Latinx female perspective and so on and so forth. So I think it all boils down to the project description and whether or not that fits with that. But you know, I don't think that it's an end all if the project isn't inclusive of every single community or person or identity, because I think one of the things I really, you know, that I've seen or that I gravitate towards are like things that are specific to specific audiences. You know, I don't speak for everybody. I don't know everything or know every aspect of the world or society, but would hope that through arts and through some of these cultural programs that I get to learn a little bit more. And so I would say that, you know, that it's okay to be intentional and not necessarily have something that includes everyone and everybody.
Yeah, I agree. And I think sometimes having an idea of your audience or the community that might be involved in your work can also give a little bit of clarity to your own process, and also possibly to the panelists about thinking who your work might connect with, and also possibly help you with marketing. Like, there are other things too. I think sometimes it is, like Richard said, just unrealistic to think that it's for everyone, because one, is it truly, and then how? So yeah, I think being specific can be helpful for you and for the panelists, but mostly for you, really.
Great. Another question about audience served. Daniel asks, when filling in the section on anticipated number of audience members served, can we list a number for the work presented online or specifically the Queen's exhibition event? In this case, it's a video art project.
Yeah, I would say include it all. I would say if it's a video art project, every, you know, person that has seen that video could be counted for sure.
Yep. The benefit of doing things digitally, we have some really precise metrics. And next, and I think this will need to be the last question for the evening, Gordon Haber asks, there is nothing in the application meaning Queen's Art Fund, about social justice themes, correct? It's about new work from Queen's artists. And then in the chat, people were chiming in about different types of Queen's Art Funds projects that have been funded in the past. And Molly Abrams helpfully linked to examples of previous Queen's Art Fund applications and helpfully explains that many have nothing to do with social justice. Panelists, any other thoughts on the relationship between Queen's Art Fund and social justice projects or lack thereof?
I mean, I think it doesn't have to be blatantly stated in the description or the title whether or not it's a social justice project. You know, that also depends on, I feel like we're not there to be at the conversations that are happening amongst like the people that are in the room to deem what's like social justice or not. You know, our very existence can be an act of social justice or social defiance. So, you know, I really do believe in that in terms of, you know, for queer artists, for instance, you know, like taking up space and being there and showing up, you know, I think that in itself is a social justice initiative from my end. But I don't think that all of the projects that we've seen or looked at had that social justice topic in it, but it does come up though, even though it's not stated in the description or the title.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this year it came up a lot because we were talking about the pandemic, and we've had to shift a lot of the artist work to respond to what was going on socially. So there were maybe social justice would be the wrong term to use, and I would probably apply another term in lieu of that.
Yeah, I would add that I think what matters most is not matters most, but one of the many criteria is the relevance or benefits to the community. And that's where maybe some social justice elements play in, but that's definitely not a pre-requirement. I've seen applications that use all the buzzwords, but don't really demonstrate a good quality or any authentic benefits, and that I don't think that would be a good strategy just to tailor to the social justice concept.
Great. Thank you all so much for being here this evening. As we wrap up, I just want to remind everyone that we're having another workshop on January 19th, actually about fittingly how to transition your work to the digital sphere, sort of best practices and showcasing your work online. So that is free as well, and feel free to RSVP. I want to thank our three fabulous panelists for taking the time and sharing their insights. I really appreciate it. And for everybody listening, you will again have first priority for our Ask a Gatekeeper series to open to you all on January 14th. So check your email for that. And after this workshop, I will share all of the information, the PowerPoint, a recording of this workshop should you want to revisit it, as well as the slide deck. So thank you all for your time. Again, thank you so much, panelists, for joining us and helping us empower artists.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Take care, everyone. Have a good evening. Bye. Stay
Bye.
safe.
Thanks, guys.